Hello, welcome to my channel. As he had stared death in the eye, or rather, his best friend during his final moments, Naruto had gone through every moment in his life that had meant something up to that point, until eventually he was claimed by what should have been eternal darkness. It was at that moment that he should have died. In his final moments, he'd talk with her about anything and everything that felt appropriate, reminiscing about the days in the academy, before everything went wrong, their first mission that had gone horribly wrong once they'd encountered a couple of rogue nin from Kiri, and up until the retrieval mission. They'd shared a couple of quick jokes about that fight, and the irony that their last one had been here as well. It felt a bit poetic, that the place that started the last parts of their journey, was also the place that ended it. Before he felt his consciousness start to leave him, he'd seen the people that helped him before his eyes. His parents, the old man Sandaime, the pervy sage, Kakashi-sensei, and all of his friends he'd made along the way. In the end, he couldn't really say that he had many regrets. His biggest regret was that he hadn't made it to Hokage. But he had managed to save her. And in the end, that's what really mattered to him. Their endless game of cat and mouse had come to an end right where it had started. So, he died with a smile on his face. Well, that was what he had believed at least. It was safe to say he'd been surprised and flabbergasted once his consciousness had developed enough to understand that he wasn't dead. No, he'd been reborn, in a world that was beyond strange. At least to him, since everything that had once been normal to him was practically a fairy tale here. While everything in this world was what should have been a fairy tale. The irony of the fate that he had tried to deny for his entire life. It wasn't that bad, aside from the fact that he missed everyone in the place he used to call home. His new family had also questioned why he hadn't referred to the mansion as his home for quite a while, but he'd managed to blame it on the stupidity of being a kid until he had gotten enough used to the place. He couldn't quite get used to the idea of not being an orphan anymore either. It was quite surreal. In this place, he had parents that loved him, an older sister, and an older brother as well. Everything he'd ever wanted really. Though, he still felt that something was missing, and he didn't need to think long about it before an image to mind. He often thought about his past like this, sitting in his room, just staring out of the window as the image of her face, the rare times she smiled, came to mind. Even after 17 years, he could still remember her face clear as day. Then again, people always said the first thing you forgot was the sound of their voice. And he missed that a great deal. He let out a soft sigh as the image faded from his eyes, and watched his reflection in the window. While it was ironic, he couldn't stop himself from letting out a few chuckles. In this life, he'd probably gotten the appearance that his first mother, Kushina, had hoped he'd gotten back in the elemental nations. While he'd once been blonde, he was now a redhead. His hair was as usual, pretty messy, but his facial structure reminded him more of his new older brother, and his eyes had the same blue-green look to them. His wardrobe had also gone through a bit of a change. Well, that was probably what you had to expect when you got reborn as a son of the House of Gremory. Currently, it was his sister that was the heiress. And she was in an unfortunate situation. She was betrothed to the youngest son of the House of Phoenix. An absolute asshole, if you were to ask him. Naruto let out a small grunt as he stood up, and watched himself in the reflection. He could be seen wearing a long red jacket that was unzipped, thus revealing the black long-sleeved shirt beneath. To finish it off, he was wearing black pants, boots, and brown shoulder guards on top of the jacket. While orange was usually his preferred color, he couldn't quite help but love red. As he'd told his mother back when he met her in the seal that held Kurama, he'd have loved to have her red hair. And now, well, he did have that hair. Though, he was still missing a lot from his old home. It was one of those situations where every time he went to bed in the evening, he'd felt a clenching in his chest while thinking back to the countless memories he had. He really missed them all, and while he cared deeply for his family here, there wasn't much he wouldn't trade for a chance to speak to everyone back home again. At least just for a little while. Especially because he didn't know if they were all right. Whether or not they were still trapped in the infinite Tsukuyomi, he could only wonder about it since there were no real answers to his question, no matter how hard he looked for them. As he sat there in the window of his room in the underworld, just thinking, he soon found himself brought out from his line of thought. A magic circle of communication appeared before his ear, which made him raise his brow in surprise. "Naruto, are you awake?" a soft feminine voice spoke about, as he nodded. Well, not that she could see it, so it was probably more for himself than anything. He chuckled a bit and moved down from the windowsill and went to lay down in his bed, staring up at the ceiling as he kicked his boots off. "Yeah, I'm awake. What can I do for you, Rias? Is everything all right?" A silent laugh met his ears as he folded his arms under his head. "Just wanted to hear your voice. It's been a bit since I've seen my little brother after all. How is life treating you?" "Well enough, just training and studying a bit every now and then. I hate books though. Dad can't give me a break about it," he snorted with a small pout. Rias let out another small laugh at that. "Yeah, I can imagine, just hang in there. Are you coming to Kuo anytime soon?" Naruto let out a soft hum as he readjusted himself on the bed. "I don't know, I probably could. I don't feel like staying down here much longer anyway. Let's just say that Dad and I are butting heads about more than just the whole studying thing. It's a bit of a problem really. Please, go easy on him. I think I got an idea why you're arguing so much, Rias sighed softly. I'll try, but it's not easy. I don't like what's going to happen with you. I wish I could do something, but that old man is even more stubborn than you can be, he joked idly and ran a hand through his crimson locks. His older sister, while he couldn't see it, was smiling on the other end of the line as she spoke softly to him. Not much we can do about it. I really don't want to either. You know that, maybe, just maybe, we can find a solution. I don't want to just have someone picked out for me, you know. I want to be able to pick the person myself. Naruto once again nodded. Yeah, I know. I'll talk to you soon, Rias. I'm gonna go out and train here in a bit. I need to get some frustrations out of my system. Alright, take care, Naruto. Come visit soon. Even Akano misses you, she joked slightly, as the connection along with the magic circle disappeared from his ear and he sat up again. The redhead sat up and put on his boots again as he started to wander around his room. Which was fairly large. Well, they did live in a mansion, so he had everything he could dream of inside his room. Like, if he didn't need food, he could live there in there with no trouble at all. It made him chuckle a bit since he was once forced to live in an apartment where you couldn't even count on the water temperature or whether or not the fridge was cooling properly. He'd never forget that spoiled milk from before he got on Team 7. While he normally despised the idea of fate, he had to thank it for one thing though. He'd somehow, despite the ridiculously low chance, managed to keep his old name. Naruto. So he at least had that, for as long as he was going to be in this world. And since he'd found out devils almost lived forever, well, there was a chance he'd be here for a really long time. He wouldn't jinx anything though, since he had quite the history of getting into trouble. With the last chuckle at that thought, he exited his room and began walking down the hallway of the mansion. Each stop would echo slightly off the walls as he minded his own business, but he did politely greet the maids that occasionally passed by him as they were carrying out the duties for the day. Where are you going at this hour, Naruto? The redhead stopped in his track as the familiar sound of a voice he'd grown up with met his ears. He stood completely still as he closed his eyes for a second, taking in a breath before he turned his head to meet the gaze of a man with long red hair that looked a lot like him. Naruto fidgeted a bit in place as he replied, just going out to train, to vent some frustrations I guess. I won't take long. Zeoticus let out a slight hum as he gathered his hands behind his back. May I ask why you're frustrated? The younger redhead clenched his fist and dug his nails into the palm of his hand as a sour look fell upon his face. I'm quite sure that you know why I'm angry. And yet, you still don't seem to care. So why do you want to address it again? Do you like making me mad or something? His father narrowed his eyes slightly as he became visibly a bit tenser. I don't like that tone you're using. Well, that's an odd coincidence. I don't like the decisions you make. Naruto shot back with a roll of his eyes. Zeoticus frowned as his lips fell into a thin line. What is this really about? You've been hostile for quite a while. It worries your mother and me. We figured you were long past this phase. Naruto threw his arms out in a shrug as he turned around to face his father. Then you tell me how I'm supposed to feel. You're forcing my sister to marry some kind of a self-obsessed asshole, and for what? It makes you look good. I don't get it. It is her duty. I've explained this many times in the past, son. Zeoticus defended, stressing his sentence through his teeth. The Gremory snorted at it with a mocking chuckle. Yeah right, like it's apparently my duty to believe whatever crap you feed me. How can you do that to her? Give me one good reason outside the usual crap that makes it seem like you got any right to do what you're doing. Zeoticus stepped up to him with a shake of his head. She is the heiress to the house of Gremory. She has a duty to this house. And this is it. It'll give us a tie to the Phoenix. Can't you see how much is at stake? Me, what about yourself? Can't you see that it's ruining her life? You got no right to mess around with her life like it's some kind of chess piece in some stupid game. Naruto shouted back as he slammed his fist against the wall. The older Gremory rubbed the bridge of his nose. You will never learn, it seems. Why can't you understand that as the head of a house in a society like ours, you sometimes need to make decisions that serve a higher purpose? I don't know, maybe because it's beyond stupid and irrational. You are forcing Rias, my sister, to be degraded into some kind of object. If that's how you treat your family, then I want out. Strip me of my name, I don't give a crap. If that's family love of the Gremory, I'd rather have no last name, Naruto hissed out through gritted teeth, refusing to look his father in the eyes. Zeoticus unfolded his arms from behind his back and gave the young man a small glare. I'm starting to believe I've spoiled you too much. I had high hopes for you, yet you stand before me as nothing but a child. Naruto laughed as he walked up to his father, standing just a few inches away. And you're an old man and a fool. I think it's about time that you back off before you force me to do something you'll regret, son, Zeoticus warned in a dangerous tone. The younger redhead rolled his eyes as he stood right up in his dad's face. Oh, I'm starting to want you to make me. Come on then. Before any of them could say anything further, a form stepped in between them and pushed Naruto slightly backward with a gentle push. Venelana, Zeoticus asked as he looked down at his wife with a sense of curiosity in his gaze. The brown-haired woman shook her head and held a hand on her youngest child's shoulder. How about you go to our room, Zeoticus? I'll speak with our son and resolve this issue. Let's not make any bad blood come into this family. He is being disrespectful, he does not know his place in this house, Zeoticus said with a shake of his head. Venelana sighed. Our room, now. I said I'd handle this, and I plan to do so. The head of the Gremory family shot a look between his wife and his son before he sighed and left without another word. The echoes of his footsteps would soon start to faint until they could no longer be heard. Jerk. Naruto snorted and crossed his arms over his chest, looking out of the window as he tried to calm himself down. Venelana shook her head and patted his arm. I know you're having a hard time coming to terms with the arrangement. I just hope that you know, that while your father sees this as the best for the house, his views as a dad are completely different. Don't you think he'd rather Arias found true love somewhere? Naruto shrugged his shoulders. How should I know? All he seems to care about is our damn name. His mother let a faint smile grace her lips as she reached up to touch his cheek and turn his head. Look at me. Your dad loves Rias, don't misunderstand his actions for anything they're not. I can't understand him if I don't know what he is thinking, he answered in a soft tone. While he was angry at his dad, his mother hadn't done anything wrong as far as he knew. Venelana just patted his hand and readjusted his jacket. Take a trip to Kuo, go visit your sister. I think both you and your father need a bit of space to think clearly. Plus, Arias always knew how to calm you down, I doubt she would have an issue this time too then. The redhead scratched the back of his head. Fine, I plan to go there soon anyway. Then be on your way, say hi to Rias for me. I'll try and talk with Zeoticus, but I can't promise much, you know how it is. Make sure she is alright, I can understand if she is stressed out, his mother finished with a small squeeze of his hand before she started walking down the hallway in the same direction his father had went. As he watched her disappear around the corner, he let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. If Venelana was anything like Kushina, she probably had everything under control. It made him laugh a bit, there really was nothing like a mother's wrath. Oh well, he'd have to take an opportunity to kick his old man's ass another time. Seeing the redhead waltzed through the streets of Kuo leading toward the academy, as he whistled a soft tune to himself. It was mostly just to pass the time as he made his way to the occult research club, though as he got there, he sweet-dropped at the sight of the very much empty room. Hello, he called out into the room and blinked but there came no response. It was quite odd because he for sure knew that Rias was around the clubroom at this time. They should be out doing contracts, but it felt like something was wrong. Naruto clicked his tongue as he looked around the place for a bit, and took a seat in Rias' chair at the lone desk in the room. Swinging his feet up onto the table, he sat with his fingers folded across his stomach as he counted the seconds passing. Which wasn't for very long, since his impatience started to show. With a grunt, he stood up again and began to exit the building. Well, if there was one way to surprise her, he could always just track her down. He let out a soft chuckle as he opened the door leading outside and leaped into the air, folding out his wings, which he still was quite amazed about, and flew in the direction he could feel Ria's magic signature. Though something was off, and that was the amount that was leaking around in the area. Either she was having a violent argument with Akano again, or there was trouble. Either way, he decided that he probably should hurry a tad bit more as he flew over the city of Kuo. The lights of the street lamps below him passed by in blurs as he got to the outskirts of the town, and had to raise a brow at the sight of a church. That's weird, he commented as he stopped in the middle of the air a couple of 100 feet away so he could look in through the windows. His blue-green eyes eyed the situation inside carefully. Which wasn't something his former self would have done, but since he'd been born and knew he'd have a lot of opportunities to learn, to be better. The scene in front of him caused many questions to rise in his mind. The church looked, well, destroyed, but the people in there were what caught his attention. On the left side, toward the door, he could see his sister and what appeared to be 4 members of her peerage if he were to judge by the uniforms. He knew 3 of them, Akano, Koneko, and Kiba, but the last one, that had to be someone new, and judging by the red gauntlet he was wearing, he had to be a user of a sacred gear. Even with that in mind, he looked worse for wear, with a hole dripping blood in both his legs, leaving him nothing but a cripple in the current situation that looked like it was about to escalate any second. But who is that? He asked out loud next, his eyes narrowed at the group on the opposite side of the church. He could see 5 individuals, and the thing they had in common was the fact that they were fallen angels. They were quite a colorful bunch, with 3 women and 1 guy, but there was something strange about particularly one of them. 4 of them were looking like they were about to drop unconscious from exhaustion and wounds and had 1 pair of wings. However, the woman at the front had 6 wings, and she looked perfectly fine. Naruto hummed thoughtfully as he flew down to the entrance of the church and leaned in against one of the support beams to listen in on the conversation. While he'd usually just rather drop down through the ceiling, this was a more sensitive matter that he couldn't quite just disturb in case he got the wrong idea. You know I can't just let you go without further ado after such an incident. It wouldn't look well for the House of Gremory, he could hear his sister say, as he crossed his arms over his chest. Though the next voice seemed just a tad bit uninterested, I don't see that you have much of a choice. While there might be 5 of you and 5 of us, you're still severely outnumbered. Your servant can barely stand, and he is guarding a corpse. Rias snorted. While Issei might not be able to fight, it doesn't look like your crew can do much better. We've already established we're superior in that matchup, so what will the addition of you increase in terms of chances? The woman sighed slightly. That will not be an issue. Either way, the chances are in my favor. I don't see the need to make any more out of this situation. The odds are not in your favor, Lady Gremory. Naruto shook his head as he figured that was his cue to get involved. Well, he probably shouldn't, but he'd be damned if anyone talked to his sister that way without him having a say in what was going to go down next. Leaning up from the wall, he cracked his knuckles and entered through the front door. Then how about we even the odds? He called out as his footsteps began to echo throughout the church, his appearance catching the attention of the people inside, who all had mixed opinions upon seeing him. Rias looked both pleased and surprised, but there was also a hint of anxiety on her face. She probably had no idea what her unpredictable little brother was about to do, or why he was here in the first place. The fallen angels looked both skeptical and annoyed. The favor they were certain they had was starting to look slimmer by the second. Naruto, what are you doing here? Rias asked as she took a step back to meet him halfway there, standing quite close to him as she kept her eyes glued to the group of fallen in front of them. Upon hearing the name of the newcomer, the fallen angel with 6 wings eyes widened for a brief moment. A look that couldn't quite be described was on her face until she visibly calmed herself down again. It was like she'd seen a ghost, which caused both a sense of curiosity and fear to go through her subordinates behind her. The redhead shrugged his shoulders. I thought I'd come and visit my sister, but I guess you were already having guests. Oh, trust me, they were not invited, she shot back with a snort. Yet you do not seem keen on letting us go, one of the fallen angels with blue hair mouthed through gritted teeth. The Gremory heir scratched the back of his head. Okay, so can I get a rundown of the situation and the names here? Because they might be fallen, but I'd feel weird about calling them Fallen 1, Fallen 2, you get what I mean. His older sister that to fight the urge to show an amused smile. Well, from left to right, there is the one that started all of this. Rainier, and her 3 accomplices. Donasek, Kalawana, and Mittelt. What about the one in the front? Naruto asked next, as his eyes narrowed slightly. At this, Akano bit the inside of her cheek. That is my sister, Sayuri. At the mention of that name, a flash of pain went through his head. Naruto visibly grunted as several images of his past life came to mind again, and he grasped his forehead. It was a name he hadn't expected to hear again, and once he took a look at her, it only made it worse. Because she looked just like her, with a tad bit of differences, but it was the same raven hair and onyx eyes. He felt a bit of nausea build up within him as he could have sworn it was her, that even a stranger with a picture from the elemental nations would say it was the same girl, but it was impossible. Are you okay? Rias asked with concern, as she touched his arm with a worried gaze. The younger redhead gave a quick nod as he was brought out of his line of thought. Yeah, I'm all right. So what's the situation? Rias sighed and took a step forward, not truly convinced but decided to let it go for now. Let's just say they haven't been playing nice. And Rainier even went as far as to both kill and torture my new pawn, Issei, and kill the holy sister to steal her sacred gear on our territory. With the amount of disrespect and actions against our house, I cannot let them go with just a lifted finger. The younger brother bit his tongue as he let out a grunt. You there, he called out to the one at the front. Trade offer, give us one of your subordinates as a penalty for the actions done against our family and we'll let the rest of you go. Sayuri narrowed her eyes at him. I don't have the power to do that, it is not within the orders I've been given. You know this can only end one of 2 ways, and I gave you the most peaceful solution, he retorted with a hand on his hip. The raven-haired woman gave him a curious stare. I'm well aware, I've given my solutions. She paused and looked back with a look that turned stone-cold serious. You 4, leave, now. Rainier shook her head as she stood back up to her feet. Lady Sayuri, we couldn't possibly. I gave you a direct command, and you'd only make everything worse. I'll make sure Azazel hears of this, she interrupted quickly, effectively silencing the red-eyed woman who reluctantly let out of her wings and flew out through a broken window behind them, soon followed by the rest of the fallen angels. Rias took a quick step forward. What do you think you're doing? I wasn't done yet. As the crimson-haired girl finished her sentence, her queen was quick to follow up. That's enough, what can you possibly hope to accomplish by this? It has gone too far, and you know it. Sayuri sighed with a small frown as she took a step forward as well. As I said, I have my orders. While the inconvenience it causes for you doesn't please me, I'd rather not betray my direct superiors in a similar fashion as the others. They have caused enough problems with the current situation. With a quick glance between the 2 women, Naruto reached forward and placed a hand on Ria's shoulder. Why don't you let me handle this one? It should be me, her subordinates have hurt members of my peerage. Rias quickly replied. Naruto shook his head. That's true, but she hasn't. And given I'm an intruder here as well, why don't you just let us misfits sort this one out? Go take care of your new peerage member, he looks ready to break down or pass out, or both, I can't really tell. While it didn't please her, she couldn't deny that her peerage did need some attention. While they'd been winning with little difficulty, aside from Issei who got quite beaten up, the tables had turned completely once Akano's sister had shown up. Even Kiba and Koneko had some bruises, so Rias knew that the raven-haired woman was quite a formidable opponent compared to the others. Fine. But don't get hurt. Rias relented, as some of her caring sides began to show. Oh, don't worry, it'll be fine. After all, I'm the strongest. He chuckled and began walking a couple of steps forward toward who'd inevitably become his opponent of the day. The dark-eyed woman shook her head as she dropped down from the altar she'd been standing on. I don't know if you've been in a fight before, but there is usually not this much talking, she commented with what appeared to be a small grin on her face. I'm well aware, Naruto commented as he stopped in place, eyeing the woman in front of him. Part of him couldn't the flickering image out of his head, that it was the same girl he'd once been on a team with. He knew better though, he'd lost in that last fight and died. So while he could easily imagine that scratched headband on this woman's forehead, and recognize they shared the same name, he knew it wasn't her. It was not the girl he'd spent several years chasing after back in the elemental nations. So, she began, visibly on edge as she stared him down. The situation was tense, to most it'd just be because of the inevitable fight. However, to them, it was because they both felt like they were seeing someone they hadn't seen in a lifetime. Ladies first, Naruto commented with a slight chuckle, making both Rias and Koneko roll their eyes in the background. The woman rolled her eyes. Please, spare me of the false chivalry. It's disgusting, she retorted quickly as she thrust her palm forward, and immediately thunder could be heard. Naruto looked around him quickly, unable to spot any lightning, though as the magic became noticeable he flipped backward as a bolt of pure white lightning struck down through the ceiling, lighting the carpet aflame. However, it didn't stop there. No, instantaneously afterward lightning bolts began crashing through the windows, sending glass shards flying all over the church, the benches following the example of the carpet as the entire place was soon filled with a mix of smoke and flames. Thinking quickly, he leaped up against the wall to get down beside her. He clapped his hands together as he channeled his power of destruction before he thrust both of his palms toward the ground. It wasn't a largely concentrated burst of power, but it was enough to create a brief shockwave that forced her to dash backward and out of the window behind her. As he saw that his plan had worked in regard to getting her out into the open, he quickly followed her. However, to avoid some kind of ambush, he used the window on the opposite side of the church and instead used his wings to fly quickly over the roof. Since Rias had to be focused on gathering her peerage and taking care of them, he figured a lot of smoke and fires wouldn't help her. Before he could re-enter the fight, he was forced to maneuver around a barrage of light hurled at him at, well, light speed. He retracted his wings and spun down between them, rearing his fist back as a red glow started to form around it. Sayuri narrowed her eyes as she raised her hand to form a defensive magic circle to meet the impact of the incoming redhead, and was forced to widen her eyes in surprise when his fist effortlessly shattered the defensive spell like it was a mere glass pane. She forced herself to hold back a chuckle as she flipped backward, and slammed a fist into the ground as dark clouds started to gather above them. Naruto did a quick grimace as he figured out what she was intending and quickly thrust his hand toward the incoming lightning bolts. Letting a stream of red destructive power, almost looking like crimson flames, seemingly devour them. Her plan had worked as intended, the fallen angel dashed forward and spun around on her feet. Letting her heel swipe straight toward his chin. The redhead saw it coming and ducked quickly beneath it, using what he determined to be an opening to send a roundhouse kick toward her stomach which she seemed to effortlessly catch in the palm of her hand, keeping a tight grip on the sole of his foot as he commented, I'm surprised, I haven't met many that are skilled at hand-to-hand combat. Likewise, she shot back quickly and pushed his foot up into the air and let go before she dropped down to swipe her leg at his lone foot that was still located on the ground. Naruto let out a swift grunt as he jumped into the air and spun around to evade the attack they'd sent him crashing down on his rear, and responded quickly by placing his palm against the ground and angled his body to swipe a kick to the top of her head. The raven-haired fallen angel leaned back as she watched his foot fly by right in front of her eyes. Annoyed with how persistent he was, she blitzed forward and launched a series of kicks and punches at him, aiming for every anatomic weak spot she could potentially strike with her full strength. But it wasn't working. No matter how they were moving around, his hands and legs were matching her speed perfectly. It was frustrating, yet exhilarating at the same time. With the exception of her father and a handful of others in the Gremory, it was rare that she found an opponent that was as adaptable as her in the martial arts. Though it was easy to see that her fighting style was much more refined than his, even though he could keep up with her. The two let out a shout as the soles of their feet clashed once again, the force of the impact sending them sliding in each direction respectively before they regained their footing. Naruto decided at that point he'd been on the defensive for long enough and swirled his palms around in front of him, letting his wrists touch as a red magic circle appeared from which a giant seemingly flaming serpent flew out toward the dark-eyed woman. She narrowed her eyes and evaded it by flipping sideways over it, forming 3 quick light spears that she shot straight through the snake's midsection, watching it explode into a small shockwave that sent her hair swaying around in the hair behind her. Sayuri grunted as she thrust her hand to the side of a small magic circle, from which she quickly pulled out a sword. A Japanese chokuto, to be specific. This game has gone on long enough, she called out as she channeled her magic through the blade, letting the shining metal get coated in pure white crackling lightning. Naruto couldn't help but feel a sense of deja vu at the sight, but quickly shook his head and mirrored her action. One thing he'd picked up from his memories of his Sayuri, along with the training he'd undergone in the underworld, was to never underestimate the art of swordsmanship. This world had many blades with all kinds of different yet terrifying powers. So it was more than beneficial to be able to wield one, in case you were either forced to fight with a blade, or you found yourself in the possession of one. The redhead sighed as he grabbed onto the hilt of a sword that his older brother had gifted him a couple of years ago, and dragged it out of its magic circle, revealing a crimson broadsword with a rapier-styled hilt. Then let's get a move on, I was getting bored, he retorted as he let the power of destruction coat his already crimson blade, making it appear like it was aflame in contrast to her lightning-covered chokuto. The woman rolled her eyes as she dashed forward, slashing the crackling blade at his neck that he quickly blocked. A mix of sparkles encased in crimson flames and white lightning flew over the field and through the trees with each lightning-fast clash. From afar their blades would merely look like a pair of twin windmills glowing colorfully that had occasionally slammed together, sending shockwaves all over the area as the speed got more and more picked up between them. Despite feeling confident in his swordsmanship, Naruto had to admit that she was way better or just more experienced with the blade. Each deadly stab and slash would put him more and more on the defensive. The occasional opening would allow him to get a bit more aggressive and push her a couple of steps back, but she'd return the gesture tenfold afterward. He was starting to visible sweat as they flew through the woods, watching the treelines blur past their field of vision as they avoided branches and boulders in their way. Eventually, the redhead couldn't keep up anymore and felt his blade swiped out of his hand as he landed on the grass with Sayuri a few feet away from him. He could hear his blade swelling down through the air before it embedded itself within a boulder. I guess I still got a bit to learn, he commented as he snapped his finger, letting the magic circle retract the blade away from the human realm. Sayuri eyed the action and held up her blade, the metal doing a small clink as she pointed the tip of her blade at him. Does that mean you are ready to admit defeat? I would rather not have to spill your blood if I don't have to. I have no desire for hostility between our factions. The redhead rubbed the back of his neck as he slammed his foot into the ground, using the cloud of dirt and debris to backflip up on top of the boulder his blade had previously been embedded into. Sorry, I can't do that. I made a promise to Rias, and I'm not going to break it. I don't go back on my word, call it a personal code if you wish, he chuckled as he reared his palm back into the air whilst in a crouched down position. And thus decided that he might as well take the fight a step further. Since he'd found himself enjoying the fight a bit more than he should, he hadn't gone all out. Also because he didn't want to start a new war. Despite having found himself with a whole new power in this world, Naruto had done everything in his power to recreate his very own invention. A thing that had come in clutch several times in the elemental nations. When he'd gotten a good mastery of the power of destruction, he'd worked his hardest at combining that with the concept of the raisin shuriken, which resulted in the enormous spinning crimson shuriken in his hand at this moment. The concept of cutting with the wind was replaced with the red and black blades born out of the concept of destruction itself. Though, before he could do anything with his creation, his heart stopped in his chest. As the cloud of debris cleared between them, he was met with a sight that had haunted his dream for several years. With his field of vision now clear, a pair of eyes as equally shocked and terrified as his own was staring right back at him, or rather, the spiraling shuriken in his right behind his back. And at the same time, his eyes were staring at the huge bow composed of crackling lightning, and the tip of the deadly arrow that was aimed toward the small spot right between his eyes. A flash of pain shot through his head again as he fell down to one knee and grasped his forehead. The raisin shuriken faded out of his existence as he couldn't stop the images flickering in front of his eyes. The view in front of him kept switching between one of the last things he saw before he died. The very last battle he fought in his old life as Uzumaki Naruto. Sayuri didn't seem to be any better. The moment she'd laid eyes upon his attack, she had taken a step back and lost control of the lightning in her grasp, making it explode across the ground beside her as she dropped down to a crouching position. Her eyes practically shook as she stared him dead in the eye. No, that's impossible, Naruto grunted out as he clenched his eyes shut to stop his blurry vision from spinning around so much that it couldn't seem to focus on the woman in front of him. She, like him, stopped and covered her mouth with her hand as her large onyx eyes roamed across his being. But instead of seeing him, she saw the faint outline of a familiar blonde man behind him. Is that really you? She thought to herself, too unsure of the idea in her to speak out loud. As if on cue, they lifted their heads for one last eye contact, before their worlds went dark and their bodies slumped down to meet the soft grass beneath their feet. Their heads were just inches away from each other so that the last thing they was each other's faces. The young Gremory heiress let out a worried sigh as she sat sideways on the couch within the Occult Research Club's specified clubroom. In front of her, she looked down, or more specifically, on her lap, where the head of her younger brother was currently resting. She stared down at his closed eyelids as she tried to remain calm while idly combing his hair with her fingers. Occasionally he'd grunt, or twitch in his sleep as if he was having a nightmare that she couldn't wake him up from even if she tried. No matter what, she could stare with her blue-green eyes, whilst making sure her beloved brother at least was comfortable until he came back from whatever was haunting him. Her mind was filled with questions at the same time. She couldn't piece together what had happened to him. As soon as she and Akano had made sure the peerage was alright and not on the verge of death, she'd rushed after him. And much to her surprise, she had found Naruto passed out in a field of grass with sweat pouring down his forehead. At the same time, the fallen angels had returned. Not to fight, but merely to retrieve one of their own. Himejima Sayuri, her queen Akano's younger sister, had also passed out. And she couldn't help but wonder how she and Naruto had come to that state, or what had happened to them. Rias knew her brother was strong, way stronger than she was. While she'd had other priorities whilst still somewhat trying to remain at a decent enough level of strength, Naruto had prioritized training. She'd often teased him or nursed his wounds, or both, whenever he came back from training. Which was a thing she deeply admired about him. He was a hard worker. In many ways, she thought she could wish that someday she could be like him. Even when he'd told her that she easily could, it had felt like a distant and impossible task. One which would only shatter the remains of her self-esteem, even if that'd never be his true intention with the suggestion of her training to become like him. Rias, a voice called from her left, making the crimson-haired girl turn her head to meet the tired violet hues of her queen. She cleared her throat, and forced a small smile onto her face. You can go home, Akano. I'll wait here for a little while longer. I'd rather not move him anymore until he has woken up. The dark-haired girl switched her gaze between her king and her younger brother, letting out a soft sigh as she reached down to touch his forehead. Almost cursing out in surprise at how feverish his skin felt. Do you think he is going to be okay? He doesn't have a choice. If he isn't, I'll kick his ass, she huffed, but Akano couldn't be fooled by the front Rias put up. She could easily tell that the girl was much more worried than she'd openly admit. She shook her head. I wonder what their connection is. Even when they first saw each other, it was like it wasn't the first time. I've never heard him talk about her though. Rias blinked in surprise at the suggestion of the two being connected, but in the end just shrugged. Maybe they knew each other, maybe not. We can only play guessing games until this idiot decides his nap time is over. I know he isn't poisoned, and he isn't injured. I just can't fathom why he is still asleep like this. He looks miserable and peaceful at the same time. With a careful eye roaming down Naruto, Akano let out a quick breath. If anything happens, let me know. I can even stay here with you if you want. I can bring a spare change of clothes and spend the night. The Gremory shook her head. No, go home, Akano. I'll take care of him. No matter how stupid he can be, it's my responsibility. Used to say the same once. Oh well, have a good night, Rias. Akano bid farewell, giving the king of their peerage a quick nod before she left through the double doors. The hinges creaked audibly throughout the room until the loud thump signaled that the doors were closed again. For about half a minute she sat there completely still. She just looked at him, and wiped his sweaty forehead with a piece of cloth, before she pushed him up against the cushions. With her cheeks turning a faint pink, she scooted down the cushions of the couch to lay down by his side. The lack of space that'd fit two people forced her to wrap her leg around his, and pull her arm over his torso as she rested her head on his shoulder. Not that she'd complain. As she felt the heat of his body warm her up, she placed the palm of her hand against his cheek and dragged her nails caressingly down before they landed on top of the left part of his chest. Feeling the heartbeat in his chest, she closed her eyes, letting the comfort lull her into a gentle sleep. Seeing Naruto's eyes slowly fluttered open, his blurry gaze repeatedly trying to focus despite how the entirety of his body felt weak and heavy. He couldn't lift a leg even if he tried to, so all that was left was for his eyes to stare up at the dark sky above him. He slowly tilted his head down to the side, grunting in pain as his blue eyes settled on the form laying beside him. His blurry gaze would look down to the place their arms were meant to be, but all that could be seen were an outline of blood dripping down the rocks. A sense of worry spread through him as he watched her closed eyes, his eyes drawn to her chest until he saw it slowly rising and falling. He breathed out a sigh of relief before turning his head back to look up at the sky. She's still alive, thank Kami. He sighed as the relief spread through, making him relax just a tad bit through all the pain in his body. He lay there for quite a while. If here to guess, 10 minutes went by before she showed any sign of life aside from her steady and soft breathing. Naruto smiled a bit at that, but didn't turn his head to look at her. You've finally come to, eh? Sayuri. At the sound of his voice, he could see her hurriedly turning her head from the corner of her eye before she winced out in pain. A look of shock and horror spread on her pretty face as she realized the damage their last attacks had done to each other. He let out a chuckle. As you can see, if either of us moves too much, we'll bleed out and die. He stated, in an awfully calm tone as he just stared at the moon. Why? She started in all but a soft whisper, her lone open eye staring at the side of his face. Why would you go that far? You never attempted to cut me off. Not even once. Why do you keep involving yourself with me? She finished in another soft whisper, the tone of her voice starting to betray her. Naruto smiled again as he turned his head to watch her with a grunt, his blue eye locked with her onyx one, their faces just a tiny bit apart, because you're my friend, though that sentence had felt like a lie for a long time. A sense of deja vu washed over her as her eye widened at that, but what exactly does that mean? To you anyway. He turned his head back to look away from her, letting himself feel the deepest parts of his mind before speaking freely, since this might as well be his last chance to let her know what he really meant. It's just that, when I see you take on stuff, and you get all messed up, it kinda hurts me too. Sayuri let out a soft gasp at the proclaim, her remaining hand twitching idly at her side as she felt a hard clench in her chest and something prickling at the corner of her eyes, the number of thoughts running through her head making her feel dizzy in an instant. Everything they'd been through, and all he'd ever said and done to get her to come back to where she belonged. Come back to him. It made the pain in her chest feel so much worse, as each similarity the two had growing up, came crashing down over her like an avalanche. Their memories, her own and his playing before her eyes as if the connection, their bond, allowed her to see everything there ever had been. It hurt. But it wasn't before the last one, that she openly felt the tears begin to drip down her cheeks. The moment she saw herself, in the group with everyone else, the realization of all the time she'd felt alone, with no one to understand her, she had never really been alone. They had all been right there, but she hadn't been able to see it. She felt that it became harder to breathe, as she saw the mental image. Everyone and she was right there, standing by his side. Like she'd never left, because he'd never cut her off, not even tried to. As they came to again, Naruto was the first one to open his eyes. His eyes flickered around as he saw the blue sky above them, and heard the gentle sound of birds in the distance. Don't tell me this is really heaven this time. He chuckled faintly. Sayuri let out a faint giggle as she looked back at him. Looks like we passed out and slept until morning. We've failed to die again. She laughed gently. The blonde tried to sit up, but the pain in his body immediately forced him to lay back down. Damn, guess it's too soon to move. He sighed, and just when I thought I could punch you to wake you up, he grunted out in disappointment. Her eyes widened a bit before she burst out into a fit of giggles. Despite the pain in her chest, she couldn't help it. What's so funny? He asked next. Sayuri turned her head to watch him again. You really want to keep fighting? He growled out in annoyance. Of course. I'll fight you as many times as it takes. I accept it. Huh. I lost. Naruto blinked slowly, before a tick mark formed on his forehead. You idiot, this has nothing to do with winning or losing. My friend was sulking as usual, and I just wanted to punch her to wake her up. She gave him a soft smile before she closed her eyes and turned her head back. Hey, Naruto, I accept you. If I die here, the chain of war will end. The battles since the Sage of Six Paths. This is another type of revolution. I'll decide this issue myself, once and for all. The blonde gave her an outraged look as he fought with all the strength he could find in his body to move a little closer, the blood still dripping from the place his arm used to be until his face was just beside hers. How can you decide anything by dying? You might as well live and help me instead if you're just gonna do that. He paused quickly, before he started again. What I want to do is cooperate with all of the shinobi. And that includes you, of course. Who says everyone else will agree to that? She whispered softly. Naruto let out a snort. Oh come on, do it again, let out some more crap like that. There is no telling when I may stand up to defy you again in the future, Sayuri continued as she eyed her eyes to stare at him. Surprised at how close his face was, their noses just inches from touching. He shook his head. You won't do this kind of thing anymore, was his reply, filled with confidence. How can you be sure of that? She asked next, her lower lip slightly trembling. At this, Naruto decided that enough was enough. He could keep giving her half the truth, or he could say what he meant all along. What that had been the actual feeling in his heart, throughout all this time they'd been chasing each other. It's quite simple, for something that's felt so complicated for such a long time. He chuckled and gave her a small smile. I love you, Sayuri, and I would have chased you in the next life too if that's what it'll take for you to finally open your eyes. The look of surprise on her face spread like a wildfire, as her cheeks began to heat up to turn a considerable red despite the bloodless she'd undergone. She fumbled a bit with her words until she felt the clenching in her chest slowly begin to unravel, and a surge of happiness began to fill her up instead. Shut up you loser, I love you too. And, thank you, for everything. She expected some kind of reply from him, but when she looked toward his eyes, she noticed they were closed again. Naruto. That's not funny. With a loud grunt, she rolled onto her stomach, panting heavily as she raised her shaky hand to feel his face. It felt cold and sticky, but as she moved her fingers down to push them against his throat, her eyes slowly widened. At the lack of a pulse, tears began to drip down her face again. As her cheek slumped down against his arm, no words were able to leave her mouth. Not that anyone could hear them. He was dead. Gaizeing, the youngest Gremory, sat up with a loud gasp as his eyes hurriedly flickered around the room to figure out where he was. His chest rose and fell as he held a hand over his heart, feeling the rapid heartbeat inside his chest as he tried his hardest to catch his breath. Those last memories, I've never dreamt of them before, but how? I was dead, wasn't I? He thought to himself, the panic spreading throughout his being until he felt a pair of warm arms wrap around his torso. And something soft and squishy pressed against his stomach. You're finally awake, I was worried, he heard someone say, and he slowly lowered his gaze to see the sleepy face of Rias laying up against his side. Slowly sitting up, but not unwrapping her arm from the grasp she had on him. Naruto scratched the back of his head. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you worry about me. I guess I'm an idiot, telling you'll handle things and then you had to take care of me. Rias shook her head and flicked his nose. Nonsense, we're siblings. We take care of each other, got it? The younger redhead just had to nod in defeat, allowing Rias to give him a relaxed yet victorious smile as she gave him a quick and tight squeeze. Did you have a nightmare? You were restless, I almost thought you were poisoned or sick. Kind of, Naruto admitted as he scratched the back of his head. I can't remember it too much though, you know how it is with dreams. The red-haired girl shook her head and sat up straight, though she leaned in against his side so she wouldn't fall off the couch. You always were a lousy liar. So why don't you just get to the point, and tell your big sis what is wrong? Part of him felt a bit unsure of what to do next, but he decided he might as well give her at least some of the truth. Even if it wasn't the complete one, it was somewhat a nightmare, and I died, I guess. Felt very real. Did it have something to do with the girl from today? Rias asked next, reaching up to slightly play around with his hair, just tidying it up a bit. He raised a brow at her but didn't comment on it. She'd always been very touchy with him. She liked to just sit around and mess with his hair, and since she found it so humoring he'd never decided to comment on it or ask her why she was doing it. No, it was someone else. It was just weird. There had been a battle but it wasn't really part of the dream, it was just like the last moments. You know, that time where your life flashes before your eyes. She gave him a quick nod and a smile as she leaned up to place a small peck against his forehead. I know what you think of, but you're safe and alive. So don't worry about things like that. Naruto chuckled and returned the nod. Alright, so what happened with that girl? The blonde one, I think. Rias let out a tired sigh. In short, the fallen angels that came wanted to steal her sacred gear, Twilight Healing. And they succeeded, so she unfortunately died. My new pawn, Issei, is quite down in the dumps about it because they'd become good friends. The fallen called Rainier is the one that got it now. Couldn't you just have revived her with the evil pieces? Naruto asked curiously. She nodded her head with a small shrug following. I could have, but it didn't seem right. She was a holy sister and all that. And while I'd love to save everyone, I only have so many pieces. I can't save everyone that gets caught in the crossfire between rebellious faction groups. Naruto let out a soft hum. I think you should still do it. She is a healer, and she is probably kind if she didn't care if Issei was a devil. I don't know him, but he seemed to care for her the brief few seconds I saw him in the church. It'd also make him happy. Do you really think so? Isn't it a gamble? It's not that I don't want her, I'm just a bit unsure, like, what would you or Sirex do it? He let out a few chuckles and tapped his index and middle finger against her forehead. You don't always have to compare yourself to us, you're your own person, Rias. And life is all about taking chances, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. What matters is what you decide to do with them afterward. Even if she doesn't get the gear back, she can still become strong and a precious person to your peerage. You make it all sound so simple, but you don't even have a peerage yet. She teased idly and rubbed her forehead. Naruto shrugged with a sheepish smile. Do it, Rias. Before it's too late. I got a good feeling in my gut about it. I don't want to force you to do anything of course, but I got a feeling that it's going to work out great. She shook her head a bit at his antics and slowly crept down from the couch and stood up to her feet, doing a small stretch that put her chest a bit more on display. Fine, I'll take your advice. Thank you, it's nice to have someone to ask advice from once in a while. While he caught himself staring a bit too much at the slight jiggle, he quickly turned his head away and inwardly cursed his former godfather for the occasional thoughts he got in situations like these. Don't you have Akeno for that? Naruto asked next. Rias gave an immediate nod of her head. Of course, she is my queen and second in command. It's just a matter of perspective, and with things like this, while I without a doubt appreciate her help, it just helps a bit that another one with evil pieces can give me their thoughts as well. A look of understanding crept onto his face as he swung his legs over the couch and stood up himself. That makes sense. Oh well, I'll go out and take a bit of air while you do all of that. I guess I need to clear my head a bit after that weird dream. Before he could wander off, she reached forward and grasped onto his wrist. Come to my place after, please. Him? Why, is something wrong? Naruto questioned with a raised eyebrow. Rias chewed on the corner of her lip as if she was looking for the right words to use. Let's just say I'm still worried. And I don't want to leave you out of my sight because then you might find yourself in trouble again. And you sure it isn't just you wanting to sleep together in the same bed like when we were kids? He teased her with a small smirk. A pout formed on her lips as she elbowed him in the side. Fine, go find a bench to sleep on then. I'll be there, don't worry. Now go on, and tell her I said hi. Or don't, she doesn't know who I am, he realized with a deadpan expression. Rias rolled her eyes a bit, but smiled nonetheless. I'll let her know while I inform her of what happened. I'll have to take her to see Issei after, it'll help both her and him through this experience. So, it might take a bit before I'm home, you sure you can stay entertained for that long? Naruto let out a small snort as he crossed his arms over his chest. Oh, I'm sure I'll be fine. If you say so, I'll be there in a little bit. Have fun, she smirked and started to leave through another door in the school building. As he stood there alone, he let out a tired sigh. He didn't enjoy lying to Rias about his nightmares, or memories, but he was afraid of what she'd come to think of him. For all he know, he stole the place of who was supposed to be her actual little brother, so he didn't know whether or not he was some kind of imposter. Regardless, he couldn't dwell on it. He'd done that enough. No matter what he thought or said wouldn't change the fact that he was her little brother now. And he quite enjoyed that. Having an older sister like her was amazing. Even if he caught himself staring at her more often than he should, that had to be Jiraiya's fault. Right. He shook his head to clear himself of those thoughts as he made his way out of the occult research club, folding out his wings as he leaped into the air and started gliding through the air and over the city. Just tapping his chin as he tried to figure out where he should go. In all honesty, there was only one place he really wanted to go to. And that was the Gregory's base. He wanted to kick down the doors, and stare Sayuri in the face, and make sure it was really her. Part of him was still unsure. It felt too good to be true. If she was here as well, then all those times he'd missed could finally be over. He could be reunited with her once again, one of the things he wanted most in the entire world. Naruto let out a small sigh as he landed on a nearby water tower on the outskirts of the town, holding out his palm as he summoned the queen piece of his evil pieces set. He'd often wondered what she should do in regard to his peerage. Because, where he came from, he was just a genin. He had of course wanted to become Hokage and be the leader of their home and everything, but now that he actually stood with the position of the king for a peerage, he wasn't sure what to do. Even after giving Rias advice about taking chances, he was being hypocritical. Having doubted every idea he'd gotten since he got the set of evil pieces. Though, there was one thing he wouldn't ever doubt, and that was who this piece truly belonged to. Letting the white queen piece fade away from the palm of his hand, Naruto sat down on the edge of the water tower. One foot dangling over the ledge, and the other placed firmly on the top to support his arm as he rested his cheek against the palm of his hand. If it really was her, then she'd probably be here sooner or later. With how they departed from the elemental nations, there were so many things left unsaid, so many things they hadn't been able to do. Gazing, her onyx eyes opened as she stared out over the Nephilim Institute, one of the many bases of the Gremory. After he fight in the human world against some of the devils, she'd passed out after seeing someone she thought had died a long time ago. In fact, she'd seen him die, felt him die at her side as a consequence of her own actions. A thing that had haunted her for her entire existence afterward. Even once she'd been reborn, the mental image had haunted her in her sleep. Sometimes her imagination would get the better of her, making the image that much more gruesome and terrifying to think about. To think that he was alive, that he was here and in the same place as her, was a thing that made her feel a thing she hadn't in a long time. Hope. In the time she had spent as a fallen angel, she tried to right her wrongs as much as she could, but it never felt enough. At this point, after seeing his face, she knew there was only one thing left in this world that could make her feel at peace with herself again. His forgiveness. In the midst of her train of thought, a knock sounded on her door, making her turn around with a small blink of her eyes. "Come in," she called out, standing near the window in her room as she watched the door creak open, revealing the large form of her father. Barakil gave her a quick nod as a greeting, as he scratched his beard with a thoughtful look on his face. "Pardon the intrusion, I know you said you wanted a bit of alone time. I, however, wanted to hear how you were doing after the mission in Kuo." A faint outline of a smile lifted her lips as she returned the nod. "I'm fine, father, thank you." "I see." It was just unusual to hear the report from Rainer's little group. He continued, trying not to voice too obvious disappointment in regard to the fallen angels his daughter had been sent to apprehend. Sayuri sighed slightly. "I assure you that I'm fine, however, there was something I wanted to ask you." With a quick raise of her brow, Barakil just nodded. "Ask away." She crossed her arms under her chest as she leaned in against the wall, her eyes gazing out over the institute. "What can you tell me about those devils?" "The Gremory house." Had it been any other house of the 72 pillars, it might have been an issue. The Gremory isn't a specifically high-ranked house, with the exception of Syrex Lucifer since he is one of the current Satans. Abael married into the house long ago, so the 3 children of the current head of the house all seem to possess their inherent ability. Barakil started, rubbing his bear as he tried to sort through all the information he had available. Sayuri hummed at that. "I see, what about the children?" Barakil let out a grunt as he took a seat near the wall. "The oldest is Syrex, and the next one in line to the house of Gremory would be his little sister Rias. And then there is the youngest of the bunch, Naruto Gremory. At the mention of the last name, she felt a small clench in her chest as she grasped the fabric of her shirt. What can you tell me about Naruto? It still felt weird to say his name, but at the same time, it felt good. Is there a reason for the sudden interest? Barakiel asked. She shook her head quickly with a small shrug. Even if it was a lie, no, not aside from that he is the one I supposedly fought against. While still remaining a bit skeptical, Barakiel decided to believe her for now. Well, he is a promising young man. We don't know much about him, since he isn't as public as the rest. Rias resides in Kuo, and Sirex is the current Lucifer, so it's easier to hear information about them. Naruto, however, has seemed to remain in the underworld most of the time. Can you tell me what we do know at least? She tried again, fidgeting a bit with the sleeve of her shirt. Still unable to decipher why his daughter was like this, Barakiel continued nonetheless. As I said, he is a promising young individual. Reports state that in regard to combat prowess he is very talented. Current rumors spreading around the underworld call him the second coming of Sirex. Sairi's eyes widened a tad bit in surprise, but at the same time, she gave a small smile. No matter where he was, he always strived to work hard, and that made her happy at least. That meant he was most likely still the same knucklehead she remembered. I see. What's going to happen with Rainier and the others? They did manage to steal a sacred gear. Given that the sacred gear didn't belong to a devil, the major problem lies within that it all happened within Gremory's territory despite the obvious warning from the heiress herself. Azazel is still pondering on what decision to make, though there is a chance that it'll be handed back, he pondered. She gave him a confused look. Removing a sacred gear is like a death sentence, and there is no guarantee that the sister is alive. Unless she was reincarnated through one of the evil pieces. Regardless, should this become an issue with the devils, the first and most obvious way to fix the problem would be to hand back what was stolen. Barakiel sighed, not being a big fan of it himself, but it was a suggestion from one of the other fallen in charge, aside from him. Sayuri fidgeted a bit in place as she turned her gaze back to her father. What if there could be struck a devil with the Gremory? A look of amusement lifted his face. What would that involve? Unsure, the sacred gear is returned. They most likely have someone in either of their peerage that would benefit from a sacred gear should the sister still be deceased. If they're open to the idea, we could introduce the suggestion of them reincarnating Rainier. She herself would benefit from being in a place where her prejudice for devils wouldn't be tolerated, and her lack of strength wouldn't be tolerated as much as it does here, Sayuri pondered out loud. Barakiel let out a grunt at that as a small smile lifted his lips. While it's an innovative idea, we can't count on it. No one says they want Rainier as a reincarnated devil, as we all know she isn't the strongest. She herself admitted that as part of the reason she wanted Twilight healing in the first place. Along with that, she did damage to Rias Gremory's peerage and also mocked them for their race. I'm not sure that she would take that offer that well. Sayuri nodded in agreement, which is why I'd suggest we send the invitation to her brother. Rias gets the gear, and we let Naruto Gremory get the offer in regard to reincarnating her. That way she avoids the death sentence, gets to work on her prejudice, and will get stronger. Everybody wins. Except Rainier, Barakiel commented. Better than being dead, Sayuri countered. The large man sighed and stood up from his seat. I'll take it up with Azazel, though we'll need a messenger. And at the moment, we do not know where Naruto Gremory is. Rias is as usual within Kuo, but the younger brother hasn't been seen since the church incident a couple of days ago. Sayuri responded quickly as she readjusted her black locks. Allow me to be the messenger, I'll track him down. You seem quite interested in this boy, it makes me wonder why, Barakiel voiced out loud. She shrugged. He is an interesting character. He just gave a nod at that, figuring that it was about everything his daughter would allow him to know. If that's all, I'll go have a talk with Azazel. I'm glad to see you had a swift recovery, daughter. Your condition had me worried. She raised a curious brow. I was just passed out, hardly anything to fuss about. Though there was one other thing, a bit of a side question, I suppose. Well, ask away, what's on your mind? Barakiel asked. Sayuri looked a bit uncertain at first as she eyed her father, chewing on the inside of her cheek before she let her thoughts be known. If I were to, hypothetically, leave the Gregory one day, what would happen? Barakiel looked shocked at the question as he stood up. What brought this on all of a sudden? Nothing, I just never saw myself living here my whole life. While I know that as a fallen my lifespan is considerably longer than a human's, I didn't think I'd be here to the end of time, she said with a small shrug. Her father looked beyond skeptical. Does this have something to do with the Gremory boy that you're all of a sudden so interested in? Do you know him? Starting to get a bit annoyed, she shot him a mild glare. No, and even if I did, it wouldn't be your business. Just answer the question, father. What would happen should I decide one day to go out on my own? Barakiel sighed and rubbed his forehead. Since you don't know any faction secrets that could potentially harm us, nothing would happen. Though you'd be on your own and without the protection of the Gregory, and if you one day were to cross us without it being intended, you would label yourself an enemy in the eyes of the faction. I wouldn't be able to protect you. I can take care of myself, she grunted and crossed her arms again. I just don't understand you. Sayuri ran a hand through her black locks. It is what it is, father. One day I'm not gonna be here anymore. Please don't make it out to be some kind of big deal. If I'm not going to get in trouble, it's only really a problem for you. While that verbal blow hurt, he couldn't deny that she was right. If that's your decision, I won't stop you. Good. I'm not going to leave right now, but in the future, as I've seen myself elsewhere. Still unable to let the thought go, Barakil himself crossed his arms over his armor. I feel like you at least owe me to know whether or not it has to do with the boy. You don't look me in the eye in regard to him, so I know you aren't being truthful. You're my daughter, and I want to protect you. I feel like you could at least be honest with me because of that. I'm not leaving because of Naruto Gremory, so just stop asking about it. See, I'm looking you in the eyes right now, she finished and gave him a blank stare. Technically she wasn't lying. She didn't leave because of a boy whose name was Gremory. In fact, it was a completely different surname. It was just a coincidence that they shared the same first name. Fine. I'll go talk to Azazel about your idea. At least refrain from leaving until that mission has been put down or accepted. Barakil finished and walked out of his daughter's room, closing the door behind him in the process. The raven-haired girl let out a loud and tired sigh as she slumped down in her bed, turning her head to stare out of the window as she fidgeted with the sleeves of her sweater. Now all she had to figure out was where he was. Seems like they had one more game of cat and mouse before things could be settled, and for once the roles seemed to have been reversed with her being the one chasing him. Gaizing, the young redhead, let out a slow sigh as he stood on top of the water tower looking over Kuo. The rain dropping from the sky annoyed him a great deal as he folded out his wings and brought them over his head to shield himself from the rain. Pulling the hood of his jacket over his hair, he crossed his arms over his chest and settled for just staring out over the city for the time being. He hadn't felt like going back to Ria's place yet. Ever since the incident with the fallen angels, he'd stuck around in Kuo just to be on the safe side. Plus he'd rather not deal with his father at the moment. While his mother was more understanding of him, he'd rather not get into another argument when his mind was currently elsewhere. At the same time, he couldn't stop thinking about Rias. It both hurt and angered him that the wedding ceremony was coming closer with each passing day. There was close to nothing he wouldn't give to be able to just kick down the doors to the Phoenix Manor and give Riza such an intense beating that they'd been forced to cancel the contract, even if he were going to be in serious trouble for it. He chuckled sourly at the thought. Even Rias didn't want that, so he was going to have to stay put, for now at least. Despite how much annoyance it was, he'd stay put and wait until he could do something. The redhead let out a grunt as he kicked a small pebble down the water tower, and thought about it being time to fly home. However, the second he folded his wings out from above his head and was prepared to jump down from the ledge, his blood ran cold in his veins. A presence appeared behind him, which made him turn around in a heartbeat with his sword summoned to his hand. His blue-green eyes stared at the person who'd just arrived. In front of him stood a tall man with black hair, golden bangs, and a black goatee. Though the most eye-catching feature, and the thing that was also making him feel almost scared, were the 12 jet black feathered wings sprouted from the man's back. Looking like a never-fading black. What do you want? Naruto asked as he took a step back, feeling his heel dangerously close to the edge of the water tower as his eyes stared into the man's violet ones. A sound chuckle traveled through the air as he put a hand on his hip. Am I to assume you know who I am? Given the number of wings you have, I have my guess. Though I'm starting to feel like this is some kind of joke with how many fallen angels seem to be trespassing around here, Naruto commented and tightened his fingers around the blade's handle. The man rolled his eyes. Come on, put the pointy thing away, and let's talk. We both know if this were a fight you'd already be dead. You didn't even see me coming before I let you. With an uncertain gaze, Naruto relaxed a bit and let his sword disappear into a magic circle. What do you want? He asked again. In case your guess was wrong, my name is Azazel, Governor General of the Gregory. In all honesty, it's a pleasure to meet you. I hear many great things about you, Azazel revealed, grinning a bit as he crossed his arms. The redhead nodded his head. Likewise, ain't every day I get to talk to a faction leader I'm not related to. He chuckled a bit. Azazel mimicked the small laugh. I can imagine. So, I know my little subordinates have caused some trouble, and I'm here to work out a solution. They were out of line, and that's what that is, but I'd rather not have it become a trouble I can't solve without getting involved with Syrex. I assume you got an offer coming or something. Wouldn't make sense for you to come in person otherwise, Naruto said with a raised brow. The fallen angel nodded. I most certainly do. You see, we have something in our possession that doesn't quite belong to us. Which is apparently the whole objective of what caused this issue. He let out a slight snort. Yeah, your crows stole sacred gear from a nun here in our territory. And continued to disrespect my sister and her peerage. Almost killed some of them too. Look, I'm a man of my word and I don't particularly like hostility. I'm prepared to return the gear to the girl if she is somehow still alive. Either that or I'll let someone in your peerage or your sister's peerage take it. Sound good, Azazel said simply, wiping some raindrops from the fabric of his maroon-colored coat. Naruto narrowed his eyes a bit. I'm not buying it. Oh, why's that? Azazel wondered. The young man shrugged with a skeptical gaze. I'm not overly convinced that you're gonna sacrifice one of your own people just to give a girl of the church her sacred gear back. Azazel sighed. Look, as cold and cruel as it may sound, if this issue had been only about the girl, we could have cared less about it. This is an issue I'd rather stay between the small groups and not the factions as a whole. Who knows what could potentially happen from stepping on the toes of not just one of Lucifer's siblings, but both. Rumor does say that he is quite fond of the two of you. So what offer is it that you're proposing? Naruto tried again, seeing a bit of logic in what the man was saying. A small grin lifted Azazel's lips as he spoke calmly. What would you say to have a new member in your peerage?